Q&A live from Docklands in Melbourne. I'm Virginia Trioli, stepping in for Tony Jones, who can't be here tonight. Joining me to answer your questions, the Victorian CEO of the Urban Development Institute, Danni Addison, the Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel, Dan Tehan, comedian and broadcaster Dave Hughes, Australia's leading tax lawyer and corporate strategist Mark Leibler, and Tasmanian Labor Senator Lisa Singh. Please welcome our panel. Now, Q&A is live on ABC TV in Eastern Australia and live everywhere else on the ABC News channel at 9:35 Eastern Standard Time. And you can watch and listen live on iView, YouTube, Facebook, ABC News Radio and Periscope. You can't escape us. Our first question tonight comes from Singh.
Looking at the record low approval numbers of President Trump and now the landslide defeat of Marine Le Pen, are the signs ominous for our own right-wing populist politicians, such as Pauline Hanson and Cory Bernardi?
Thank you for that question, Prasan. Dan Tehan, we'll start with you tonight. It wasn't quite the result that the far right might have been after.
Look, I think what you need to do when it comes to elections in different countries is you have to look at them on their merits in each individual country. Obviously, we had an election here in Australia which saw the Turnbull government return. We've seen in the US President Trump, he was elected. In France, you've seen Macron be elected. And in France, we obviously had in Britain, we had the Brexit result. Now, each one has individual circumstances. Each one, I think, the people in those countries voted according to what they thought was best for the futures of their countries. And I think that'll continue to be the case. These sort of sweeping generalisations as to what's occurring across the globe, I think, can be rather simplistic. And I think you'll find each country will vote according to what it sees best for its future, and that will be the way that it will continue to be.
Danni, Malcolm Turnbull's original appeal really was as a centrist, much like Macron, really, when you look at them written down on paper. Is that, in your view, his greatest electoral strength, Malcolm Turnbull's, the fact that he can be, when he chooses to be, a centrist?
Oh, look, I think what he can be is a Prime Minister who governs on behalf of all Australians, and I think that's what Australians are looking for. And he judges issues on their merits. He looks at them and thinks, OK, what's in the best interest of Australia, and governs accordingly. He also includes his cabinet and his backbench in the way that he governs, so he's very consultative. He also goes out into the community and listens in the community as to what people think is best for the nation. And I think as a government, if we can continue to do that, we'll be a very successful government.
Danni Addison, can I get you to comment on the result there in France?
Oh, I just think it's something that we'd all want to watch very closely. The dynamic globally in terms of where political power sits is changing, and especially for young people are really looking at this and trying to understand, what does this mean for me in the political dialogue that I participate in longer term.
Dave Hughes, I know you've been dying to be asked a question on the French election.
Well, I have. I mean, and like it, very similar to America, really. A man beat a woman, and the man had a 25-year age difference with his wife. So, and also a man who's never ever run for any office before. A man basically with no idea is now their president. Very similar to America. Seriously, it's a polar opposite, but sort of similar result.
A paradox.
You know, yeah, like he's never run for office before, and he's 39, you know.
And they wanted him.
Well, they wanted him, and they've got him, and we'll see what happens.
Mark Leibler.
I think they're fed up. People everywhere are fed up with the established parties. And they're going to... Macron, for example, yes, he may have beaten Le Pen, but he himself doesn't come from an established party there. So they're looking for change, and there's a lot of destabilisation, there's a lot of unhappiness in the world today, and people often don't think through what the other side, what the alternative is going to do. They just want to get rid of the leader that's there at the moment. That's what happened in the United States, although Hillary Clinton didn't exactly help herself, and clearly that's what's happened in France. The two established parties, their candidates didn't get up.
So they'll go for change,
yes,
no matter what that change, when you dig down into it, might actually be.
Yes, but the change might be short-lived when it doesn't actually end up by meeting what the expectations are, which is likely to be the case.
So Lisa Singh, you know, the far-right candidate didn't get up, but it's not really good news for the established parties, as Mark Leibler says.
Well, I don't think, as Prasan's question went to, that it means the kind of, you know, anonymous outcome for populist politics. I think populist politics is still going to be around for a little while, but it was an ominous outcome for the far right. And I think that should be reflected here in Australia. And I think the thing about...
Should be reflected here because you'd like to see it reflected here.
I certainly would
personally.
like to
Yes,
see it reflected
but as we heard
true.
As we heard from Danni, there's no logic to assume that it might.
But also, she came second, a close second. I mean, not a close second, but...
I wouldn't say it was close.
But it's like Pauline Hanson being second here, though, isn't it, really? It's a similar result.
Well, I think
Pauline Hanson getting 30-something% of the vote.
But regardless of it, I mean, there's never been so much focus on a French presidential election as this, and it was because it was two populist candidates. But I think as far as for the major parties here in Australia, I think what is most important for us is that we stand for something. And that, unfortunately, has been a real letdown as far as Malcolm Turnbull becoming Prime Minister. We once thought that Malcolm did stand for something, Dan. But unfortunately, once he took office, the far right of the Liberal Party got hold of him, and he has lost out all credibility on the things he used to stand for. And that is what's so important in politics, that you actually, you know, stick by your principles and your values, and you get out there and you try and, you know, make the country a better place based on them.
Well, Lisa Singh, on that point, though, then what, I guess, does the Labor Party stand for today, given one of the outrages of today is a particular ad that's done the rounds that you might have seen, where the Labor Party, according to its ad, seems to see Australians and Australians first, that should be employed first, as just, well, not looking like you, Lisa, but looking like white Anglo-Saxons. So what do you guys stand for?
Well, just on that, I was incredibly disappointed in that ad, and I am pleased that Bill Shorten reacted so swiftly to have it pulled.
Hang on a minute.
And that it's gone.
I've got to jump in there. He recorded the ad. He was there with the ad, so he didn't respond that swiftly to the ad.
Is he colourblind? Is he or not? No, seriously, was he there? Was he there, Lisa, when it was recorded, do you think?
Well, look, I don't know whether there was a green screen used.
There certainly wasn't a brown screen, was there?
Look, it was a shocker. It was a shocking ad, and it wasn't reflective of the some 200 nationalities that make up the Australian workforce, that's for sure.
Yes, indeed, and we can see them in the audience.
Let alone the Australian caucus, which is also diverse. But no, it wasn't Labor. It wasn't Labor. Labor does stand for diversity.
Yep,
you know, it does stand for a diversity of people and, of course, of equality and the like.
Well, so does Australia, though, doesn't it? Obviously, if you look around everywhere.
We need to move on, but what should be the consequence for whoever put that ad together?
Well, we shouldn't be going back to that advertising company.
Can I just chime in?
I somehow don't think you will, yes.
One thing about the vision thing, it's all very well to talk about vision, but in order to execute a vision, you've got to be in a position to pass legislation. When you've got the sort of Senate that we've got at the moment, I mean, you know, poor old Malcolm Turnbull, he's had to do somersaults and flips and in order to get the legislation through the Senate. It's just very difficult to execute a vision when you can't get legislation through, and that's not his fault.
All right, let's move on to our next question now, and that comes from Anna Basil-Jones.
So during Malcolm Turnbull and Trump's recent visit with each other, Turnbull actually congratulated Trump on abolishing Obamacare. I was just wondering how we as Australians can trust the Liberal Party not to do the same thing to Medicare after such a response.
All right, well, we'll come to Tehan on that in just a moment. But Dave Hughes, I actually wanted to start with you because they seemed to get along quite well, didn't they, in that little meeting?
The vision, though, was disturbing for me. I mean, I think Malcolm looked like a 13-year-old girl meeting Justin Bieber. It was just too sycophantic.
Isn't that pretty much any Australian Prime Minister meeting the US President? A 13-year-old meeting Justin Bieber?
No, I mean, you know, for whatever you think of Tony Abbott, I don't think he would have reacted like that, to be honest. But it was, Malcolm was... I didn't like it. Didn't like it.
Weren't comfortable with it.
No.
Lisa Singh, can I get you to respond to that?
I remember being a little bit like a 13-year-old girl when I met President Obama, but I don't think I'd be quite the same if I met President Trump, to be honest.
Well, the question goes, of course, to Medicare here and privatisation, given the reaction and the response from Malcolm Turnbull to the repeal of so-called Obamacare.
Absolutely, and it's a really important question because what Obama tried to put in place, which was known as, of course, the Affordable Health Care Act in full, was very similar to universal health care that we all enjoy here in Australia, which unfortunately the Americans for a long time now have really suffered under a terrible healthcare system which has crippled people into debt. And yet here was our own Prime Minister kind of praising the US President for repealing something that looks very much like Medicare here in Australia. So I'm really hoping, of course we don't know yet what's going to happen, Dan, in tomorrow night's budget, but this freeze on Medicare is repealed, that this government does start to realise that its integrity is on the line, and this is an opportunity for it to right some of the wrongs that it's made over the last few years when it comes to issues like health particularly, but also others, education, welfare and the like.
I'm sure Dan will get to all the details of the budget as this evening rolls on, so we'll look forward to that. Thank you, Dan.
Can I just say, I really think that was a little unfair on Malcolm Turnbull. I mean, he was at the United States, this was a special visit there, and all he was doing, he was turning around to Trump and say, congratulations on getting your legislation through the Congress. That's all.
After you've been left waiting for 3 hours.
But the body language.
That's what he was doing. And can I say one thing about Trump? You know, Trump will never be, you know, my role model. I wouldn't want him to be a role model for my children. But when you look at Trump, you've got to think about not what sort of a person he is, not whether he's nice or ugly or revolting. You've actually got to look at what his policies are.
But you didn't think
that's an obligation of the Australian Prime Minister. And if it's necessary for the Australian Prime Minister to have a good relationship with the American President in order to make sure that policies are generated which are going to be in the Australia's national interest, then good on him for doing it.
But he looked like he was on The Bachelor trying to get a rose. I mean,
he was obviously a little bit more nervous than some of us here are tonight.
Virginia, though, I mean, I think we've got to be a little bit fair here because we've had the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, stand up to President Trump, and he stood up to him over making sure that the US honoured the refugee deal. And he was extremely firm with him on that. He got some criticism for being so firm with him on it. So I think we've got to be very careful. Then when he went over, he was a guest of the President in the United States. It was a very important event that he was at, and he was very respectful towards that. But he also had a conversation, had a private conversation for over a half an hour. And I am absolutely sure that Prime Minister Turnbull would have stood up for Australia's national interest in that discussion that he had with the President. And of course, he's going to say to him when he's late and there's been a piece of legislation go through the Congress, he's going to say, congratulations for getting something through the Congress. The point he was making is he knows how difficult that is because we have to deal with the Australian Senate. We've been successful, but it's hard to get things through the Senate. And what he was saying was, in a similar fashion, I can understand why you were late, because this was important for you to get things through. He wasn't saying this is, you know, means that here in Australia we support what you're doing with your healthcare. As a matter of fact, President Trump praised Australia for our healthcare system. So
yes, he said it was better than America's.
He said it was better than America's. So,
which I don't think anyone could probably argue with. But I do want to jump in there, Dan, and Mark Leibler, I guess, picking up on your point as well. You're right, of course, when you're in someone else's home, you conduct yourself in a polite way. However, there are always the so-called optics back home. And the optics back home of someone agreeing with the repealing of a bit of not only legislation but something as important to the bedrock of Australian society as something that's always had bipartisan support, which is Medicare. What did John Howard say? Medicare's never had a better friend than the Liberal Party. To be seen to be supporting the repeal of something like that, poor optics.
But he wasn't supporting it. What he was saying was...
I hear what you say, but I'm telling you how it plays.
I think there's a real difference because, you know, as a former diplomat, can I tell you, when you're in another country, you don't talk about the domestic affairs of that country. And so, you know, the Prime Minister was very careful not to do that. All he made was a comment around how difficult it is to get legislation through in the current climate, and he praised the praised the
I just want to hear from
Danni
Addison before we move on.
I think it's a dangerous dangerous or a difficult situation to put ourselves in to start having policy debates that are so important in Australia through the lens of policy debates happening in other countries. So we need to mind the optics, in my opinion, but really bring back what is the debate we're having here. We're having a debate about the Medicare system in Australia. It's not about the Obamacare system in America. So let's bring it back and talk about the real issues at hand, is my opinion.
Okay. Now remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A tonight, and how could you possibly, but send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda, and keep an eye on our Twitter account and the Conversation website for fact checks, which will appear by the experts when they've analysed it all.
On optics for a second, did Melania have to tweet the photo with Malcolm behind her and Donald, like a stalker? Did you see that photo? It's a very strange photo that she tweeted. It's like...
I don't think any of us can explain the optics of that.
I missed that one day.
Yeah.
But,
You've got to get on Twitter and have a good time.
Leave it to the US experts. Now, our next question this evening comes from Elise Caldwell.
With the announcement of Gonski 2.0, it seems that for the first time in recent Australian political history, there's bipartisan support for some kind of needs-based funding education model. This is an important opportunity to address and depoliticise inequality in education in Australian schools. However, already there's been rumblings of discontent from independent education activists and from some Conservative voices in the Liberal Party, notably former Prime Minister Abbott. My question to the panel is this: do you think that in the current political climate, the parliamentarians will be able to grasp and address this opportunity for real change for Australian students? Or do you think this will result in political backflips and broken promises?
Thanks for that question, Elise. Mark Leibler, I'm going to start with you. You've been around a while.
Yep.
You've seen education policy in and out from all sides.
Look, if you look at what's been announced, it's fair, it's equitable. Ultimately, what you're looking at is treating each child alike. You're looking at the capacity of the parents to pay, and you're putting that all into the mix. And ultimately, there's not going to be a sudden shock to the system. This is going to be done over a period of 10 years. However, you know, when I came in here, I was so amused. Just before I came in here, I made a note, just so I would remember it, because I thought a question like this would arise. So, who knows what the SRS is, and who knows what the SES is? The SRS is the Schooling Resource Standard, and the SES is the socio-economic status of the school itself. Now, the only point that I would make is this is very, very, very confusing. It's obvious you've got the Catholic education sector on the one hand saying they're going to be massively disadvantaged. The government is saying you're going to get an extra 3% over time. So who's right, who's wrong? This is a very, very complex formula. I believe that the government should carry this through, but they need to be able to demonstrate, and it's a pity that there wasn't some consultation with particularly with the Catholic education sector beforehand, so that we don't have these sort of problems. So hopefully that'll take place in the future. But it's not as generous as, you know, Labor's Gonski. This is the coalition's Gonski, but I'm not sure that the money was ever there to in fact implement Labor's Gonski.
Let's hear, Mark Leibler, I'm going to wrap you up and let's hear from Lisa Singh because time is on the wing.
Well, look, finally the government has caught up to the importance of needs-based funding. What's needs-based funding about? It's something that Labor has been on about for a very long time, and through the expert support of Professor Gonski, we came up with that Gonski model. That was Gonski Mark 1. Now we're into Gonski Mark 2 with what the government's announced. But needs-based funding is all about every child in every school getting every opportunity for the best education. Now, education should be an investment. An investment not just in this current generation, but an investment in our nation and where we see our nation in the world. That is why it should be properly funded. Because if it's not properly funded, then it's not going to achieve every child in every school getting every opportunity for the best education.
And do you see this as properly funded?
No, that it's not properly funded, Virginia. It's $22 billion short. And the problem with that...
It's short of your program.
Yes, with the Gonski model that we put forward, which is really the proper model. Now,
Well, this is a Gonski model as well.
Well, it's a Gonski model.
He was standing there, standing up to it.
It's a Gonski model that's got a lot of schools, particularly Catholic schools, up in arms. I mean, my home state in Tasmania, $84 million will be worse off in our system. But the thing is, the government could fund this properly if it would drop its obsession, its ideological obsession, with giving corporations and banks a $50 billion tax cut. It could even have $28 billion left over for health, for all the other areas of public service that it seems to now be interested in funding, if it would drop that obsession.
Okay, Lisa.
So there is no excuse why every child in every school can't get every opportunity for a best education.
Let me hear from Tehan on this, but let's get back to the question, which is about, you know, whether this will, you know, actually go through, whether it'll just be subject to more political backflips and the like, and also the issue of the backlash from Catholic schools and whether you think you'll manage that.
Can I just say to Lisa, all those students, they need to get an education and then they need to get a job, and that's why we're introducing those tax cuts so we can generate the economy and generate jobs for those people. But can I say to Elise, I hope so. I really, really do hope so. I think it's time to put all the politics aside on this. David Gonski has said this is a good model going forward. I hope the Senate will support it and I hope we get the outcome.
Vegemite 2.0 didn't work, so is this going to work? Or?
Well, look, David Gonski is prepared to put his name to it. I think it's a good model. I think it's a model which means that we have a system Australia-wide which the federal government will invest in. It gets rid of all the side deals that the Labor Party did with their version of Gonski, which I understand there was about 29 different side deals. We've got away from all that, and what we've said is let's just have a system which works nationwide. So I really do hope that people get behind it and we can get it through the Parliament.
I want to quickly just go back to you, Elise. In your view, looking at this so-called Gonski 2.0, does it seem to be a proposal in your mind that is free of politics?
My view of it initially was that I thought it was a great move. It was a huge change in Liberal Party policy and the coalition policy, I should say, traditionally. And so I think for me, it seemed like it was coming from the right ideological place. I understand that Simon Birmingham is publicly educated himself, and so I thought the commitment was there and was genuine. I was a supporter of the Labor Gonski reforms in the first place, and I think that my hope would be that the dissenting voices that we're having can sort of be brought into the conversation in a more positive way, because some of the responses on Radio Talkback and in the media have just been no to any side of needs funding, and I think with both major parties now on board, there's a great opportunity.
Okay, Elise, thanks for that.
I'd say, look, I went to a Catholic school, and a lot of Catholic schools aren't elite. I mean, as in, you know, I mean, they're like a lot of disadvantaged students go to Catholic schools.
Yeah, so I went to a Catholic school, and it certainly wasn't elite, and it didn't come from a wealthy family either.
And you were dux of your school, weren't you?
Yeah, it wasn't elite, as I say. So it was a good school, but I mean, I'm saying that you wouldn't hate to see them.
The Catholic education system, as part of our education mix, is really important. It makes up 20% of our education system in this country. And, you know, your former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, isn't happy at all. And I don't even know what's going to happen in your party room tomorrow, Dan. Is it even going to get up?
It's hard to rein in Tony Abbott at the best of times, as you know. So how are you going to rein him in on this one?
No, look, what this is about is this is a good model which will work. And
if
look,
you properly funded it, Dan.
No, Lisa, if I could just have my say, you've had a very good go. It's a very good model. It's a very good approach. I actually think the model works. It is needs-based and it will work across the country. It is a huge reform. We've got to get behind it. We've got to support it. Okay. And I've already been to a Catholic primary school in my electorate. I've spoken to them. I will continue to speak with all the Catholic schools in my electorate, but I've got the figures which shows that every one of those will see an increase next year if this gets through with the school funding. And I will continue to have a dialogue with them because I actually think in the long run, this is very good for the nation.
OK, let's move on because time really is getting away from us now. Our next question this evening is from Anne Stevens.
We've been told to expect cuts to university funding and that a graduate will be asked to begin repaying their HECS loan when they are earning a mere $42,000. With the ongoing problems with housing affordability, and the Coalition's continuing support for negative gearing, one could be forgiven for believing that the Coalition has a vendetta against young people. Why does the government show such support for the already comfortable baby boomers and ignore the needs of the future generations?
And thank you. Danni Addison, well, that's got some support in the room, and I wanted to ask you if you can see whether collectively this group of policies does seem like it's just got, well, it doesn't have young people in mind.
The applause is not surprising to me at all. Housing and the, I guess, the barriers to accessing housing and to buying housing, particularly in some parts of Australia right now, is just one of the most important issues. And the context from Anne that was set in light of changes or proposed changes to HECS just makes it a topic worth considering from not only a young person's perspective but also from people who are single, coupled, families, any stage in life. Housing is an inherent part of our psyche as Australians, whether it be to be able to own housing, to rent housing, or at least to have the options that you want in front of you about where you live and how much access you have to jobs. It's something that we have to fight for in this country, it seems, at this point in time, and there's a number of reasons for why that is. My personal view is that there is no one particular solution. The federal government has quite a limited number of policy levers at its disposal, and I'm sure that we'll see it pulling as many of those as it thinks is appropriate tomorrow in the budget. But there are also levers at state and local government level that we're seeing need to be pulled. So. The reality for many young people, and I can speak both as a young person, a renter, and I guess a young mum to a very true extent. It's not easy to save up for a first home, pay rent, and pay your HECS back. And if you're doing all of that on $42,000 a year, then as you said, that's a pretty tough challenge.
Just not going to happen.
It's just not going to happen. So, I guess as a country, we are getting more mature in how we think about housing. Being a renter for a longer time is actually a choice people are making now, and that's a great thing. That's okay. But people still want to buy their own home and have that form of wealth creation and personal freedom that they so rightly deserve. So there's not one answer that the federal government's going to be able to pull. There's not one answer that an industry itself or politicians from either side of government are going to be able to pull out of the hat. But it is a conversation that resonates in a very, very real way with the electorate right now, and that will drive political decision making.
Mark Leibler, your generation got free education, universal healthcare. You could pay off a house on just one wage. Doesn't your generation owe a little to this generation?
I think what the government's doing here in relation to the universities and HECS is totally counterproductive. I mean, the bottom line is universities are an industry that, an export industry valued at $22 billion. The bottom line is that when it comes to universities, the value of the knowledge created by universities is worth more than the mining sector, the mining industry in this country. I don't believe we ought to be putting our students in this sort of a position. I think a tertiary education is incredibly important, and recently Deloitte Access Economics has actually demonstrated that the value of that knowledge adds 8.5% to GDP. That's a very, very big sum. So my view is I think that at the end of time, this is going to be counterproductive in that it's actually going to destroy value in terms of Australia overall. This shouldn't have been done.
Well, let me get a response from Dan Tehan to that.
So the Australian government over the next 4 years will spend $28 billion on our higher ed sector. What we're asking students to do is to make a contribution towards that, and that contribution will go up from 43 cents in the dollar to 46 cents in the dollar. We're keeping the system demand-driven. We're making sure that degrees will remain affordable. What we need to do also when it comes to the housing affordability question is also understand that this is a different question for different parts of the nation. So if you go outside of Melbourne and Sydney, you take my electorate, for instance, in Maryborough, in Ararat, in Hamilton, Portland, Warrnambool, Camperdown, there is very good affordable housing.
Our family home is for sale in Warrnambool if anyone wants to buy it. 265,000.
That's a very affordable house.
And it's got a lot of memories.
I think what Mark Leibler's...
Well, there you go. You don't need a real estate agent anymore, Dave.
We're touting on the program.
In all fairness, I mean, the bottom line is you're making the students repay their loans more quickly. You're making them pay more. And this applies to students who are at university now. And for some of them, it's going to make it very difficult. To
eat, in fact. So people who are struggling to eat, and you're going to make them pay back the money where Google just don't pay anything.
Mark and Dave, but one of the things that as a government is you've got to make choices in the end, and there are also...
But Mark Leibler's questioning this choice, saying this choice is the wrong choice.
He is, and we've got to make choices. We've also got to think about, OK, the carpenters, the plumbers, the farmhands and others who won't get a degree. And they are paying taxes, and $28 billion will go to the higher education system over the next 4 years. That's just in student support. There will be more money which goes for research and development. So everything is a choice that you've got to make. We think that we've got the balance right when it comes to higher ed. There will be other people who think the choices should be made a little bit differently, but everything is a balance. And unfortunately, if we're going to continue to have a demand-driven system, which everyone agrees is the right way to go on both sides of politics, we've got to make sure that it is affordable.
All right. Let's move on to another question now. Our next question now comes from Jacqueline Plunkett.
The bipartisan institutional and funding support for the proposed referendum on Indigenous constitutional recognition has not delivered an outcome in time for the 50-year anniversary of the 1967 referendum. Could Mark Leibler and the panellists please explain why there is such a delay and silence when recognition is so basic for Indigenous policy in Australia?
Mark Leibler, this is one for you. Of course, this is the panel that you're on. Why is it taking so long?
Well, I'll tell you why it's taking so long. It's taking so long because although there is overwhelming support based on the polling that's taken place for recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution, we've still got to settle on a model. Now, the Referendum Council decided that there's about 3 or 4 criteria, won't waste time on them now, but one of them was it's got to have the consent of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have only now completed 12 dialogues. They were not formulated or devised by me or by the non-Indigenous people sitting on the council. They were designed by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives on the council. They needed that time. Right. They needed to consult widely. This is an absolutely unique phenomenon. This is the first time that we've had this sort of thing actually designed by and culturally acceptable to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Now, I don't know what we're going to come up with. There is a convention in Uluru at the end of May, and in due course the Referendum Council will be reporting to the Prime Minister and to the Leader of the Opposition. But I want to say this...
Just jump in. Do you think there'll be a referendum this year?
The answer is I don't know. The point that I want to make is that this has been a unique process, and it's not what has transpired is not only the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander dialogues looking at the various options for constitutional reform. It's gone much further than that. They're looking at treaty. They're looking at their what their aspirations are. All of these things, there will be a completely new approach, which I believe government will take on board. In other words, in their dealings with government. I want to tell you a couple of things about
just very quickly,
the
if you can,
Aboriginal.
because
Very
we are
quickly,
losing time.
very quickly. Not so long ago, a survey was done in terms of the 1,000 programs which are run by the government for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And the result of that survey was that only 25 of them could actually demonstrate success. And at the same time, over the last year, large business and the government have invested, not given, invested $500 million in Aboriginal businesses. Now, my point is this: we have to move from spending money on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to investing in them and with them. The problem today, and the reason why we're not making progress, is too much money is being spent on white bureaucrats and not enough on those who need the money.
Okay, I want to hear quickly from Lisa Singh, then we'll move on to our next question.
Look, Jacqueline, I understand, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, that in the next couple of weeks there'll be a meeting in Uluru, which will be the kind of finalisation of a lot of that conversation that's been going on across the country. What's so important is that we wait for that we wait to hear what the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people tell us, because when we talk about recognition, a recognition referendum, we are talking about them and them being recognised. So it's important, so important, that we hear what that process outcome is from them, but also that if we look at the history of referenda in this country, the majority of them haven't gotten up. We want this to get up, and that's why we have to do it at the right time when it will succeed.
Dan Tehan, is the government prepared to really roll up its sleeves on this one?
It's prepared to roll up its sleeves, but we want to make sure that if time is needed, then we take the time that is needed, because the most important thing here is to get consensus. As Lisa said, we want to make sure that once a question is put, it is going to be successful. And if that takes some time for us to get there, then I think we need to provide the time.
All right. Remember, you can always join the discussion at Q&A Extra on Facebook Live and ABC News Radio right after the program tonight. Our next question is a video question, and it comes from David Stevens in Bruce in the ACT.
Australia is spending $100 million on the Sir John Monash Interpretive Centre at Villers-Bretonneux in France. It's a high-tech military museum. Wouldn't this money be better spent on today's veterans and their families? Why is Australia spending a total of $600 million commemorating World War I, which is far more than any other country that fought in that war?
David Stevens there. Dan Tehan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I don't know where the figure of $600 million on commemorating World War I comes from. We're definitely spending $100 million on the Sir John Monash Centre. But as you will have seen announced on Sunday, and what we'll see in the budget tomorrow, is a $350 million investment in our veterans. And in particular, what we're going to see, and this is a very important initiative which backs up what we did in last year's budget. For anyone who has served a day in the military, then you will be eligible to be able to get free treatment for any mental health condition, whether it be PTSD, anxiety, depression, alcoholism, substance abuse. We are also going to be looking at providing extra funding into suicide prevention, which is an issue in our veteran community, especially in our young veterans. Of course, it is also, sadly, an issue across the general population as well. For those in the audience who don't know, that the biggest killer of males between 14 and 44 is suicide. So
I'm going to jump in there, Dan Tehan, and that's exactly why our questioner has this question, which is, you know, this problem has been here in Australia for a long time. You could ask the question about successive governments and why they haven't dealt with that, and there's a Senate inquiry looking at it. So why spend $100 million on something so far away, commemorating a battle that, yes, important in historical terms, but you have such need here right now?
Can I second that question? That seems like a lot of money.
So, look, I've been the Veterans Affairs Minister for a bit over a year, And when I became the minister, I went out into the veterans community and listened to what their concerns were. And there were two concerns that they raised with me. One was when it came especially to our young veterans and the mental health services that were being provided to them. The second one was the length of time it was taking for process claims.
Well, does that answer this question then, that 100 million shouldn't be spent on this?
If you just let me finish, Virginia. So what we've done in the last year's budget and what we will do in this year's budget is spend over $350 million, and if you take last year's budget, it's more than $350 million.
It sounds like it could be $450 million.
Here on our veterans. Now, the decision on the Sir John Monash Centre was made before I became Veterans Affairs Minister. What I think of it is we do have to commemorate and remember the service and sacrifice which was made by those who went before us.
But it's not like that we don't.
I was just in Villiers-Brett now at the dawn service a week ago, and can I tell you, the French people are still incredibly grateful. Anyone who goes over there, that you will see they are so appreciative of what our young men and young women did to defend their values and their liberties.
So why don't they pay for it then?
Well, I think as a nation,
Seriously, that sounds crazy.
I'm actually going to leave it there. We have to leave it there because I want to hear from the other panel.
I'll just make this one point, Virginia. I think as a nation, we can do both.
All right.
We can commemorate the service and sacrifice of those who went before us, and we have to remember that legacy.
Obviously.
We can also look after that legacy by how we treat our veterans today, and that's what we're trying to do.
Well, that comes down to the quantum, and that's the argument. Danni, Addison, what do you reckon, 100 million?
I don't think Dan Dean's going to win this argument with this audience, unfortunately, tonight. 100 million does seem like a lot. There is some serious need, not that that's being denied in any way, here in Australia, both for veterans and for people who are not veterans in the mental health space. So as long as there's a greater focus in tomorrow's budget, I hope, on mental health services and investment more broadly, you've got my support on that. But it is an argument of quantum. It can't be denied.
Dave Hughes, I think I know your view on this one, but...
Well, have they started building it?
They have. As a matter of fact...
Can they reduce it?
It will be... It is on budget and on time and will be open.
We wouldn't want to be over budget. It's got a fair bit of room to move.
And it will be a lasting memorial when people visit the Western Front. It will be a legacy where people will be able to go and see what took place.
We get that, but let's hear from the rest of the panel.
The serious sacrifice.
Dan, you've had a good go, Dan. Let's hear from the rest of the panel. Mark Leibler?
Look, I think it's a little bit over the top, frankly, but on the other hand, in all fairness, you go through what governments spend money on and see some of the things that they spend our money on.
We'll see that tomorrow in the budget.
Well, this is not the worst. It's buried underneath the budget. That's the problem.
Lisa Singh?
We all know a lot of things don't always be on budget and on time. I think what we don't need is a memorial being on budget and on time. What we need being on budget and on time is veterans suffering PSD, mental health, having their claims processed quickly and timely by the Department of Veterans Affairs, which has not been going on in this country. That's, Dan, what your package, I understand, is addressing, and something that I actually commend the government on, as long as it is properly funded, because I know your IT system in the Department of Veterans Affairs is archaic. That's what's really important. That's what's really important for Australian veterans, so that we don't see those statistics that you just referred to before of suicide.
We actually do have a question on this, and I want to hear from Alan Ashmore, who's in our audience. So, Alan?
As a Vietnam veteran, I just see history repeating itself. 9 months ago, the Prime Minister announced a suicide prevention initiative in Townsville for our ADF people. He said it was one of the most important issues and responsibilities of our government, of any government. 6 months later, at the Senate inquiry into veteran suicide, it was stated there was no funding and it had not started. If this was a passionate commitment after 6 months, why had nothing happened?
Well, Alan, you have to look at all the other things that we were doing, the consultation that was taking place when that trial was set up, so that when the money was allocated, we knew how it would be applied and what it would go to, and so that it would work. As well as that, we set up an inquiry of the National Mental Health Commission to look at where our Defence Forces and our veterans community to see where services were lacking. We made sure that that reported before this year's budget, because we wanted to make sure that where the shortcomings were, we could fund it in this year's budget, and that is what we're doing. We have invested in research into PTSD. We have made now, if you have served one day in the military, you can now get access to free treatment for the full suite of mental health conditions. So we are working to do what we can in this area. As the National Mental Health Commission said, it is incredibly complex. It is not easy.
Alan, you just wanted to follow up?
Look, the new initiative in the budget is really good. But I put it to you that announcement was made 2 days before a feature article in the Herald Sun that highlighted many, many suicides. And there have already been 27 this year.
So, Alan, can I say to you, one of the things that I've done as Minister is I said what we need to do is get proper research on the issue of veteran suicide and what are the statistics. So we got that research done by the Australian Health Institute. I released that data in a question in the Parliament, so to get our first indication of what the figures were. In the middle of this year, we will release further data on this. I want to make sure that what we're doing is fully transparent, that the figures are there, that it's based on what we're getting from coroners, so that we know that the information we've got is valid, and we can then continue to put the money and the research into it. And that I want the veterans area and the defence area to be a world leader in this space.
Lisa Singh, do you want to just quickly?
Yeah, Dan, I wanted to ask Dan if you can guarantee for us that there won't be any cut to frontline services in you funding this new package.
No, there will be no cut to frontline services. Just to give you a sense of it, we spend $12 billion on our veterans. 98% of that is legislated. So we would have to get it through the Parliament. So it's new. It is new money. And the government is serious about addressing this issue. And I can tell you, as the Minister who has been in this portfolio for a little over a year, this has been my #1 priority.
We know this is a difficult topic, so if you're feeling distressed or upset by this discussion, then please contact Veterans and Veterans Families Counselling or Lifeline, and the numbers you can see are on your screen now. They may be of some service to you.
And Virginia, if I could just add there, we're also putting more money into the Veterans Counselling Service, so families will also be eligible to get help and counselling that they need in this year's budget.
All right, let's move on to our next question now, and it comes from Hazel Kenyon.
In the last decade, Australia recorded budget deficit. Australia's gross debt is forecast to exceed $500 billion in the next few months. While Australia is facing a potential sovereign credit rating downgrade, yet tomorrow's budget is mostly on spending. Before we identify the winners or losers of the budget, how do we plan to repay the debt from both parties, our future, which impose onto our future generations? Our future generations will be the losers of our actions today.
Thanks for your question. Mark Leibler, I'll start with you, because now apparently we're talking about good debt and bad debt. And,
I was going to say the same thing, good debt and bad debt. Look, it seems to me that if one can demonstrate that debt is actually producing income and producing value over a number of years, there's absolutely no reason why the debt shouldn't be incurred, because in the course of time, one would hope that the debt would just automatically pay itself down.
Well, so most Australian households don't have a problem with that, but for years we've been told by our politicians and the Coalition in particular that it was a debt crisis and a budget crisis, but now there's some debt that's okay.
Times are changing.
They are.
Should we the government just buy houses in Sydney and Melbourne, and in 10 years' time we'll be fine?
Flog 'em.
Yeah.
Just flip them and we'll be all right.
But I mean this goes to the matter of trust. How can you trust the government when it, once upon a time said, debt was a bad thing, and now all of a sudden, some debt is good? And also how they just don't want to talk about
to
debt.
do that, Lisa Singh.
But they don't want to even talk about debt, Virginia, anymore. I mean, since 2013, what was it, 300 billion debt at the time then. It's now got to almost $500 billion, and yet it's not even on the discussion table. And on top of that, somehow they want to give a $50 billion tax cut to companies and banks on top of that. I mean, how is that feasible and possible?
And also the government's going to...
On top of all of that debt.
The government's going to build an airport in Sydney. The government's going to build that themselves and run it. How's that going to go, do you reckon? Seriously, that's a big thing
I
to
hope
do.
very well, Dave, especially if I'm flying into it.
Well, Dave, we know how it's going to go. It's going to go by, what Anne, I think, asked before about, the students having to pay back their HECS debt a lot sooner and a lot lesser income. I mean, the government's going to fund it by, unfortunately, attacking those who can least afford it. And that's what we've got to know from this coalition government over the years.
So you don't want the Western Sydney Airport built?
I don't want the Western Sydney Airport built off the back of some of the lowest income Australians being cut. I want the Western Sydney Airport built by you abolishing your obsession with corporate and bank company tax cuts of $50 billion.
Can I just say something? It's very easy to clap, but I'm just going to say, I'm just going to say this. I mean, we're talking about $50 billion, admittedly a lot of money, but the bottom line is that if we are not going to become competitive with our neighbours and with other countries, even across the other side of the globe, then at the end of the day, companies are going to move from here. It's going to impact on growth. It's going to impact on employment. It's just, you just can't dismiss it. Look, there's two sides of this argument, which I think, is fair enough. But you just can't keep on carrying on about $50 billion and, we're wasting this and we don't have to do this and we should take the $50 billion and use it for something else.
Let's hear from Danni.
I actually think the good debt, bad debt argument is actually more than just a catchphrase. What I think it represents is politicians starting to take seriously the views of the electorate. The conversation with the electorate is maturing. Now we're talking about economic producing infrastructure and an asset in that sense that will, if we're smart and we develop our cities properly as they grow into global hubs of activity, will retain the Googles and the Amazons and what have you. However,
Danni, I've got no argument with that, but I mean, look, I'd like to think it was maybe maturing, that conversation, but isn't it simply a matter of a government that can't pay that debt down anytime quickly, so needs to recalibrate the argument and recalibrate the language?
Maybe we'll have to see. But how would Labor argue this side?
But surely Google and Amazon will stay here, won't they? Google and Amazon don't pay any tax, so why would they not be here?
So, Virginia, the first thing you have to do to start repaying the debt is to get your budget back in surplus. That is the first thing you need to do. And so what you will see in tomorrow night's budget is us showing the path for our budget back to surplus. And once you can do that, then you can start paying back the debt. We've already paid off $22 billion of debt, with $22 billion of savings since the last election. And you will see us deliver a pathway back to surplus. Then we can start addressing the debt. But until you can get your balance sheet right, you won't be able to do that. Okay. And as we've seen previously, it's always been a coalition government which is able to balance the budget and repay the debt.
That's rubbish. I'm sorry.
Well, history shows that
the
loud
Liberal Party
and
are
clear.
good economic managers is just the biggest furphy. And if we can just look at the current deficit at the moment and how it's blown out. I mean, the fact is, Danni asked what Labor would do. What Labor would do is firstly tax multinational companies that are getting away scot-free. Australian, multinationals in 2015, $300 billion was moved offshore to their parent company so they could get away with not paying any tax.
Can I just ask Mark Leibler how easy or possible that is? I mean,
no,
if it was possible, I'm sure a government would be doing it.
Mark, you are a tax expert, aren't you?
Yes, thank you very much.
Do you work for Google?
No.
I took a while to answer.
Ask him if you're going to have to pay for this advice that he's giving you, though, OK?
What I can say is I think the government has introduced some pretty powerful legislation, has made great strides in terms of dealing with this problem.
You think it'll work?
Yeah, I think to some extent it will work, but what you've got to bear in mind when you look at the Googles of this world, there's also another country outside of Australia called the United States, and they do not want the Australians taking taxes which they believe eventually one day belong to them. So it's not simple, but I don't think the government could do much better than it's doing at the moment.
Lisa, I'll leave it because I want to move on to this next question because we're almost running out of time completely. And our next question comes from Nick Bowen.
Newspapers, and in particular the Age newspaper, have been a huge part of my life. My dad actually started working at the Age the week I was born. Like many Melburnians, I grew up reading the Age, but with declining circulation, declining advertising revenue, and with online revenue not making up the difference, newspapers as we know them might not see out the decade. So my question to the panel is this: if the private sector can no longer adequately fund or profitably fund newspapers, do we need a publicly funded national newspaper to go along with our beloved national broadcaster?
Nick Bowen, can I just ask you, are you Greg Bowen's son?
I am, yes.
I can tell by looking at you. And your father writes a sentence like a bird flies, so he's one of our greats. Dave Hughes, would you read a publicly funded newspaper?
I would. Look, I'm part of the problem is that I don't read newspapers as much as I used to. I mean, because everything's online. I mean, it's tough. My wife is a journalist at the Herald Sun and she's now doing a teaching degree because the journalism jobs are drying up. And again, I want to get back to this, but it's because 80% of the advertising revenue from this country goes to Facebook and Google. I mean, they are taking over the world and it's making it very hard for local businesses to make money. So it's really tough.
Dan Tehan, you've got media law changes coming in that are clearly going to make mergers and acquisitions much easier. We're already looking, down the barrel of that TPG Capital tilt for Fairfax. I'm sure the question had a degree of cheek in mouth, but there's something about this, about what any government might have to do to ensure that you actually do have a plethora of voices in the media sector.
Well, look, can I just firstly say, back your words, Virginia, your dad is a first-class journalist, and I've loved reading him as a kid growing up, especially his sports features. They're fantastic. I don't think we need a publicly funded newspaper in this country. I think what the internet is doing is disrupting the media. I must say I'm concerned with what's happening in Fairfax, not only because of what it's doing to the Age, but also Fairfax have rural newspapers. The Ararat Advertiser, the Warrnambool Standard are two of them. This is an incredibly disruptive age for journalism. We are seeing a lot of voices out there. The Huffington Post is here in Australia, The Guardian, New York Times, as I understand it, wants to come to Australia. But most of that is going to be done online. The concern is, I think, that a lot of people now are getting their news and their facts online. And what does this mean? We have to make sure that existing media in this nation can compete. And that's what our media reforms are about. And can I say that all parts of the media, including Fairfax, are supporting our reforms. And my hope is that the Senate will support them as well, and we'll be able to get this much needed change through.
Let's hear from Danni on this one.
Oh, look, the business model has to change. I think that's pretty clear. The format is already changing, the way we engage with news and the way we drive traffic, equaling advertising and dollar revenue is changing. I think the main thing in this is to make sure that the quality of news, of journalists, of investigative reporting and of content doesn't get diminished over the time. And perhaps there is some role for government in that sense, but in terms of being involved from a commercial perspective, no, I don't agree that that's a role that government should play in this country.
OK, well, clearly we're not getting any support from our government member here this evening. There is time for one last question, and it comes tonight from Rami Mazarov.
Today is May 8, mate. Do you think this is an appropriate replacement for January 26th for Australia Day?
We're really only asking this question so we can hear you, Dave Hughes, say
Mate. I think there is some merit. I think there's some merit to when we become a republic. Surely, when the fake news becomes real news, and the royal family. Anyway, I think there's become a republic, and that's the day we should have, and make it May 8. I think it's a good idea.
Will we ever get rid of Australia Day, do you think, Mark Leibler?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really think...
You think that we will?
No. Well, the answer is I doubt it.
Right.
But personally, I think it's the wrong day. I mean, we're celebrating invasion, dispossession. It's just not right.
Lisa Singh, any momentum building towards that, do you think?
Yeah, look, I'm with Mark on this. I think that it's certainly a debate that we need to continue to have. I think it's started to get some momentum. Whether it'll be May 8, I don't know. But I think if we can relate it to our national identity, that is a way to start that debate and that discussion. And part of our national identity, I see, comes to us having one of our own as our own head of state. And I hope when that day does come that we can have a new date, perhaps, for Australia Day, as far as that goes.
Very quickly.
By the way, there is a move.
No, I'm going to have to leave it there, and we know that moves are afoot.
I'll help you with your time. I'll help you with your time constraints, Virginia. No.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a one-word answer there. Danni?
Oh, goodness. As long as... all support for the theory, but as long as in 100 years our kids don't go, God, they were all bogans.
There is a move afoot to actually change our national anthem so that it has some appropriate words in terms of our history, in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and I think that's...
Is there a particular song in mind?
Yeah, well, yes.
Can you tell me what it is?
No.
Why
it's
not?
altering... Because you're not listening to me. What we're talking about is altering the existing anthem to include a verse or parts of a verse which will acknowledge our Indigenous background, which I think is a great idea.
That might end up being even more controversial than altering the preamble to the Constitution.
No, because you don't have to have a referendum to do that. That the government can decide.
That is all that we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Danni Addison, Dan Tehan, Dave Hughes, Mark Leibler, Lisa Singh and our great audience. Thank you to you. Well done. And remember, you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra with Tracy Holmes and former Fairfax business journalist Michael West. They're taking talkback and comments on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live as soon as we finish here. Tomorrow, the Turnbull government delivers its second budget, as you know. Already, major changes to education and infrastructure have been flagged. And next Monday, Tony Jones is back to turn the Q&A spotlight on the national economic agenda, with Education Minister Simon Birmingham, Shadow Treasurer Chris Bowen and Green Senator Larissa Waters. Q&A will broadcast live from Australia's 6th largest city. Do you know what that is? That's the Gold Coast. I'll be up before dawn for News Breakfast tomorrow, so all of you, straight to bed now so you can join me. Thank you. Good night.
Still got something to say? Join the discussion on Q&A Extra now on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live. Tomorrow night, live coverage of Scott Morrison's second federal budget.
We're optimistic about the opportunities and the days ahead.
At 7:30, the Treasurer's speech live from Parliament House. And at 8, an ABC News budget special with Lee Sales and Chris Uhlmann, featuring the first interview with the Treasurer, immediate reaction from the opposition, and analysis of the winners, losers and